Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
President Trump has set to declare a national emergency that will enable him to direct billions to the construction of a border wall. Of course, we're going to have to talk about the legality of this and the expansion of presidential powers, potentially. So that's why you care, I would hope. Anytime that what our president is able to do is brought into question, it is hopefully something that all Americans care to know more about. And you might also care from the standpoint of, you're supportive or you're not supportive of the idea of building a border wall. So what happens surrounding this has an effect on that particular issue. In addition to, of course, the legality of this. And the larger issue, which is what we'll be ending the show with today, is how much power should a president have? Setting aside perhaps what the law currently says and what the Constitution currently says, as a society today, how much power, how much authority do we want our presidents to have? So with that, we're going to begin this conversation, but of course we can't get it started without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
I just wrote this down, and actually I don't think any of this discussion is about whether or not to build the wall.
I don't either. I mean, I don't think it should be.
Just for people
right?
to hear at the start of the show to know what they're going to hear. This isn't about building a wall.
Our counterparts in the mainstream cable news media may make it about that, but we don't want to distract from the importance of
that's not the issue that's involved here.
Exactly.
Is whether or not a wall gets built.
And that's not what we're focused on today. We've covered that pretty extensively. It doesn't need to enter this conversation. So we've got in front of us, just for everybody's reference, a couple of New York Times articles that we'll be looking at. In addition to that, though, we actually have Public Law 94-412 of the 94th Congress. And this is an act that is entitled, to terminate authorities with respect to national emergencies still in effect and to provide for orderly implementation and termination for future national emergencies. So that is the actual bill that today governs president's ability to declare national emergencies, the reporting process, that kind of thing. So we do have that in front of us. Check on your cable news outlets, send them a tweet and say, hey, you got that out there on your desk? Anybody looking at, what the law actually says? Probably not. Just be my guess, Lance, but, we'll not hate on him too much today. Let's get into it. The declaration is going to enable Mr. Trump to divert $3.6 billion budgeted for military construction projects to the border wall. So that's the military construction budget that he'll be able to divert. Then you'll have Mr. Trump using more traditional presidential budgetary discretion to tap $2.5 billion from counter-narcotics programs and $600 million from a Treasury Department asset forfeiture fund. So the funds are being pulled actually from several different places. The biggest one that will come into question is the diversion of the military construction budget to this area, where the other two are typically the president has more leeway on those areas, just traditionally speaking. So it's not to say they won't be questioned, but where you're going to get tripped up is there's not been much in the way of precedent for the diversion of military funds by the president. But that actually, we'll talk about here in a minute, the little precedent that does exist. The president's decision, which actually just came, Lance, probably about an hour ago when he announced around 11:30 a.m. Eastern time on Friday, February 15th, triggered instant condemnation from Democrats and some Republicans who called it an abuse of power. So keeping in mind here again that their target is not we want the wall or we don't. It's this is not within the scope of presidential power. House Democrats plan to introduce legislation to block the president's move, which could pass both houses if it wins the votes of the half dozen Republican senators who have criticized the declaration. That would put the president then in a position of issuing the first veto of his presidency. So from a logistics standpoint, Lance, the thinking here is that the act provides that Congress actually has a couple different measures. They can terminate emergencies. So, president declares it, they can terminate. And that's where the question comes in. Can Congress stop Trump from declaring an emergency? The simple answer is no. They can't keep him from declaring an emergency unless they want to repeal the ability for presidents to declare National Emergencies Act. So hypothetically, yes, they could. Are they going to? No, probably not. What else could they do? Well, so what does Mr. Trump do next? As with any other bill that comes to the president's desk, then Trump could veto it. And a joint congressional resolution terminating the national emergency, which is what the act requires. So he could veto that. And then, of course, we go back again and we see, can they override it? How strong is the opposition to a declaration in the House and the Senate? This is where we get into, can we even get it to his desk where he'd have to veto it? There's been about half a dozen or so Republicans who have made their disapproval of an emergency declaration very clear as of Thursday. And then could Congress sue? So this is interesting in that it really hasn't happened. Here, Democrats appear to have two choices. So the House could either support a lawsuit challenging the emergency declaration. So, they could just give their official endorsement or whatever of an organization who brings a lawsuit, or they could actually file a suit of their own as the House. Now, this would probably prompt legal questions all its own, which is why it's probably not likely that they'll take that route, whether or not the House actually has the authority, as an entity to do that. So it's likely a case that could go to the Supreme Court because in my reading, Lance, and I've read the whole public law. I mean, it's only 5 or 6 pages. So as far as our laws go, it's not too long. I don't see anything in this act, and this is the important thing, in this particular law that would prevent the president from doing this. The question, I think, becomes constitutionally, are we crossing the line of separation of powers? So my guess is that's where arguments would fall. And that's what we'll talk about here now.
In the courts.
Yes. So presidents have declared national emergencies under a 1970s era law, the one that we've been referencing here, a total of 58 times, and 31 of those emergencies are actually still active today. Most of them, though, have dealt with foreign crises and involved freezing property or taking other actions against national adversaries, not redirecting money without explicit congressional authorization. White House officials, though, Lance said, citing 2 different times where presidents spent money without legislative approval. That was once under President George Bush in November of 1990 during the run-up to the Persian Gulf War, and again by his son, President George W. Bush, in 2001 after the terrorist attacks on New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. So they're saying, and this is where I was talking about before, just to link it back for everybody, right, that where he's pulling the money, that $3.6 billion budgeted for military construction projects, the precedent that they're going to cite is these 2 times that the Bushes pooled and, reallocated military money using the National Emergencies Act.
But as they pointed out, neither of these was taking an action that was specifically rejected by Congress.
Right.
And that's my point here. If the president wanted to do this, why did we go through one shutdown and another threat of a possible shutdown before he does this? In an emergency, why are you waiting 10 weeks to do this? If you really think there's an emergency, then declare the emergency.
So in other words, you want to wait.
We're declaring an emergency after you didn't get your way. You're taking your ball and going home, and now you're going to declare an emergency to get what you wanted. If it was a true emergency, I mean, for those of you, I don't know anybody, there may be some really, really young listeners out there, but we remember the Al-Qaeda attack. That was a true emergency. We didn't wait 10 weeks and through a government shutdown to declare an emergency. When, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and threatened the oil fields and the Straits of Hormuz to get the oil out of the Middle East, that was an emergency. We didn't go through a government shutdown and congressional debate and then decide, well, you guys aren't going to do anything. So as the president, I'm going to do this. So my point being that an emergency means you do it immediately. You don't do it after you don't get your way. Okay. So I have a problem with the definition of, a crisis.
Well, and from
an emergency.
From a logic standpoint, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's an argument that so far I haven't really heard many people bring up, is the idea of, can't we legally though? That's where, is it sketchy for the president to do this? The argument could be right. He's intentionally trying to subvert the will of the legislative branch.
That's exactly right. That's exactly where I'm coming from.
Right. Which undoubtedly will be part of the constitutional argument that it's not the president. The president doesn't have the authority to spend money that isn't budgeted for a particular
that's
item.
The crisis. Mm-hmm. That's the emergency, is to let a president usurp the powers of the Constitution that have been designated to another branch of government. Because folks, where do you stop this? That's why I say it's not about whether you build a wall or not, or whether you're for the wall or against the wall. If this is done and it's allowed to happen, then we are taking one step closer to a dictatorship. Because then the next president, be it a Republican or a Democrat, is going to say, I don't have to listen to Congress. I don't have to listen to the Supreme Court. We have this in place to stop these kinds of things from happening. And I'm not trying to be gloom and doom, but yet, folks, this is a real slippery slope here. This is a real emergency when you start talking about one branch of power, one branch of the government who says we're not going to listen to what the other branch is saying. We're going to take that power that they have and take it away from them. That is not what this country stands for. And it has nothing to do whether I'm in favor of the wall or not in favor of the wall. Because what you have to understand, people, if you want the wall built, whatever that is for you, you're getting some, and your president screwed up because he had $25 billion or something offered to him a year ago and he didn't take it by the Democrats. But that's not the point. All of a sudden, if this president does this and builds your wall or the wall that you want, then when somebody gets into power as a president, the precedent now is being set that, okay, we're going to take your guns away from you. We're going to go into climate control. We're going to do all these other things. And that's where people need to be concerned, not about whether or not the wall gets built, but the precedent that you're setting for a president to disregard another branch of the government and where that could lead us.
So let me outline, because you mentioned that before the show, and I think it's just good for all of our listeners to take into consideration, regardless, again, of your position on the wall. Just think about, just for a moment, right? So we have this current situation, which is the president's argument being that we face a mass influx of drugs, of criminal activity coming over the border. So that's an emergency, and the solution to solving the emergency is to build a wall. Okay. So just in real simple terms, right? There's that problem. Now, just let's rewind. Okay. Trump's not president yet. We're back to President Obama. We're back there. We have these school shootings. Okay. And President Obama comes forward and says, we've got kids in this country being slaughtered by guns, which is right. I mean, he's not saying how many. He's not right. We're just saying there's kids who are being killed by guns. That is an emergency. I won't let these kids be killed. Therefore, I'm using the powers of this to, confiscate all firearms. Now, again, I can see everybody.
Congress passes legislation that says he can't do that, and he says, "Yeah, well, I'm not listening to you. I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to invoke my power, and I'm going to use the military to do this."
Right.
Because Trump's using military money. Now that's his plan is to use money from the military budget to do this. So President Obama says, yeah, I'm not going to listen to Congress's law that they've come up with and that passed both houses of Congress and came to my desk. I'm just going to totally disregard that. And I'm going to use the military to take all your guns.
I go back to, because I'm just playing devil's advocate, right? So on the gun argument, this may not have been the best example, because you go back to the Supreme Court's upheld a number of times that the Second Amendment reserves the right of the citizens to keep and bear arms. So,
but it's a national emergency now.
Well, I know, but national, and this is where you get into.
And I'm the president.
I know.
And I have the power to declare things a national emergency.
The difference, though, is there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits the building of a wall. There is something in the Constitution that would prevent a law of any kind from removing, all firearms, for example. So there could be a different argument that would be brought there in that, no, there's this piece of the Constitution that we're going to fly in the face of, and they would argue on that ground that there's a problem. I argue though, Lance, that remove all of this. Okay. Both scenarios, just forget them for a moment. I'm not certain that this Public Law 94-412, which is the National Emergencies Act, I'm not sure if it's all that constitutional to begin with. It doesn't feel like it is. Again, from a layman, not being a lawyer here, not a constitutional expert. Any law granting the president the authority to spend money that was specifically budgeted for something else seems to me to fly directly against what the Constitution states, which is that the power to legislate, to appropriate funds is explicitly reserved to the United States Congress.
Yep.
So, Obama, Clinton, go back to every Democrat that's held office too. Every one of them, any of them who's ever declared an emergency. I'm saying let's pull back even further and just say, wait a minute. I don't know. Right? If this is, I'm not sure if I'm okay with the law. Forget for a moment the Trump situation. I don't know if I love the law. What are you thinking, Lance?
Well, but the difference is none of those other ones dealt with money that had been appropriated or not appropriated by Congress. Those other national emergencies, didn't you read that in the article?
Well, they did.
58 times, 31 of those were emergency, but most of them dealt with foreign crises and involved freezing property or taking other actions against national adversaries, not redirecting money without explicit congressional authorization. So when those other folks did it, they didn't fly in the face of the Constitution as far as it appeals to Congress designating money for something or not for something.
Well, but again, this is where the contradiction comes in. The two times that the Bushes did this, they did spend money differently than it was appropriated for, but Congress had not explicitly just done something.
Just said no to it.
Right. And that's
Congress didn't pass a law and said, you know what, you can't help people out in New York City or in Pennsylvania who were affected by the Al Qaeda attack.
Because then it would have been, might have been different.
Congress didn't pass a law that said you can't spend money to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So I still want to get an answer on that, Lance, in just a second of, from a higher level, from a history perspective, are you comfortable with there being a law like this that allows, essentially, because again, the law does not specifically prohibit the president from doing what he's trying to do. I mean, just to be clear, I can't find anything in here that says he can't, fly in the face of Congress and do whatever he wants. So I'm not crazy about that aspect of it. I want to get that component from you. But before we do, we're trying to do something here today to provide a different angle, and that's to uphold our mission. And what is that, Lance?
Well, TrueChat's mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
And of course, if people have ethical concerns with today's episode, they can email ethics@truechat.org, ethics@truechat.org. Of course, if you just want to engage and let us know your thoughts, are you comfortable with the Emergency Powers Act? Are you comfortable with that? Based on what Lance and I have been talking about, are you okay with the president having this type of power? And I'm not talking about this president necessarily.
Right.
I mean, just generally.
And not this issue.
Right.
Do you want a president to be able to supersede the other branches of government?
Right.
To do what they want?
That's what I'm asking. And you can let us know on social media at TrueChat.org, Facebook, Twitter at TrueChat.org. Okay. So tell me, Lance, you comfortable with Public Law 94-412?
No, not really, because anytime there has been an emergency, it's not that hard to get Congress together.
When it's a real emergency.
To get a resolution passed. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of, the attack of Pearl Harbor and, President Wilson going and asking for a declaration of war for the Great War, World War I. It doesn't take that long to get Congress together. And you can say, well, and especially now, let's use your technology. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's say there is some kind of nuclear attack or whatever. You can tweet out there, hey, we need a vote on this, and everybody send it back by their phone and you can have it instantaneously. And again, I think people would say those would be real emergencies. If we were under a nuclear attack and the president had to take immediate action.
Well, and but he still has that power. Keep in mind this, because legally already the president has the ability to deploy troops to defend the United States, to do those things.
And then go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? So, even the argument that we're handicapping his ability to protect us is not really all that sound.
Right. Because he can, because
he can already do that.
And he did. He did put troops down there. Remember back before Christmas time, between Thanksgiving and Christmas, he did do that. Mm-hmm. And then under the War Powers Act in 1973, she then has to go to Congress and say, okay, is this all right? And if you remember, that was one of the things about U.S. troops fighting under President Bush after 9/11 was there were rumblings in Congress to withhold funding for the military. Like, okay, we're not supportive of this war continuing, so we're going to withhold funding. Now, Mr. President, how are you going to fight this war? Yes, you have the right to fight the war, but if we, Congress, withhold the money to fight the war, how are you going to pay the bills? Now, it never came to that, but that was part of the discussion. And that's what we're talking about here. That's our whole system of checks and balances. That if you remember back to your, political science class or your government class in high school, that's, your principles of democracy class that I took way back in the 70s. That's what they called government principles of democracy, was all about checks and balances. And this law, this public law 94-412 kind of flies in the face of that.
If you're a Republican out there today and you're listening, okay, regardless of just
thank you, first of all.
Yeah, thank you for listening and
having an open mind.
I want to understand how this is reconciled, okay? Because you have a split legislative branch right now, right? We've got a Senate that's controlled by the Republicans and a House that's controlled by the Democrats. So let's just take the Senate for a moment. Your lawmakers approved a bill that has been sent to the president's desk to reopen the government that included funding specifically not enough to build the full wall that the president wanted. In other words, they were saying, yeah, we agree there needs to be a little bit more physical barrier, and we agree that it needs to be over this 50, 60 mile stretch, but we don't agree. Republicans saying this, okay? Because they voted on this. It's on the record. So don't anybody, we didn't say, yeah, they did. They said with their vote, matter of public record. They all said, right? Every one of them that voted for it, and I know there's a few that didn't, but the ones who did, they all said, no, Mr. President, we don't think you need this. And I don't want the argument either. Well, maybe they were, maybe they knew that they couldn't get it through, so that's why they didn't vote that way. Oh, well, then they shouldn't have voted that way. I don't want none of this technical crap, because it gets so tired of that on both sides where it's like, well, we knew that we couldn't, okay, then vote your conscience or don't, but we're going to go off of what you voted. That's what we're going to go
behind
off
your
of.
vote.
Yeah. Or don't, and then put up a vote that's contrary to that. But don't do this. Well, I voted this way, but I'm not willing to put up something different than that. But I don't really think that. None of that. That's not where we live. So, and that's not what the standard is on this show for what your vote is. So they said, no, Mr. President, we don't agree with this. So you support the president and you support the Republican Party. Who's right here? Because you can't say that they're both right, because there's a very clear difference of opinion. And Mitch McConnell, by the way, is still getting off like free and clear. And I don't understand this either, because he's saying, right, so he lets this come to the floor, which in turn is like his de facto, I support this. But then he's also talking out of the other side of his face saying, well, I support you too, Mr. President. Which one is it? Because it can't be both, Mitch. And right now the media is letting it be both for Mitch.
Well, according to the article that you've read from for today's show, it says Mr. McConnell privately told the president he would support him despite his own reservations, but warned Mr. Trump that he had about 2 weeks to win over critical Republicans to avoid having Congress pass a resolution rejecting the declaration.
Which he's saying he'll allow, to come forward. It's like, what? I don't.
Well, but we've been critical. If you're a listener to this show, we've been critical of Mitch McConnell through the whole shutdown and this whole escapade.
To his credit, though, he's somehow maintained to keep the media, both sides of the media, like completely off his back, which I don't get. Like, what are you doing, MSNBC? Why are you not ripping him to shreds constantly for being completely contradictory?
Well, and the fact that if the president really thought this was an emergency, why didn't he go to Congress over the 2 previous years when the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress and get this passed?
Why couldn't they get it done then?
That's my whole point of an emergency. Okay. I have a real hard time with this being an emergency now.
Because the problem has lessened over.
The only thing that's happened over the last 2 years is the problem's gone down. Now it's been going down since President Obama was president, but in the last 2 years,
I think since Bush.
Yeah, it's in 2010. So yes, since Bush. So this whole idea of an emergency is a total farce. Mm-hmm. But we're not even talking about that stuff. I mean, there's so much that you can go there. I just really have a problem when we start allowing any branch of government usurping the checks and balance system of the U.S. Constitution.
Yep.
That's a very scary thing, folks. I mean, I've been reading 3 or 4 different books that those scenarios happen.
Yeah. Remember these,
and it's not about whether you like what's being done or not. It's about, well, would you like the things you believe in to be taken away from you?
Right.
That's the discussion I always had in my history classes.
Because when people
this isn't about whether or not you support this. Think about the things that you do support, and somebody gets in power and says, no, we're going to take those away. Well, no, that's not right. Okay, then this isn't right. Mm-hmm. It's like
it's a much bigger issue.
It's like the whole freedom of speech thing. I may really not like what you have to say. I may totally disagree with it, but I will fight to the death your right to say it. Because if I take away your freedom of speech, then one of these days, who's to say that somebody else doesn't come into power and take away my right to speak?
Yep.
And I don't want that to happen. The bigger issue is that, not whether or not X or Y gets done. And that's what I'm trying to hammer home on this episode. This isn't about a wall or not having a wall. This isn't about how you feel about immigration or how, pro or con or drugs or crime. That's not the issue. Yep. The issue here is we're having one branch of government overstepping their bounds in the system of checks and balances. And that cannot be allowed, because then things are going to be taken away from all of us that all of us treasure and want.
It's a dangerous road. It's the path, and you correct me if I'm wrong, senior historian. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that Trump is these people. I'm saying that this type of allowance by our government is what leads to these kinds of people. The Stalins, the Hitlers, the Mussolinis. What happened in those countries was a slippery slope of allowing their leaders to become more powerful.
They did things legally until they got so much power they couldn't be stopped.
That's right. And so again,
I'm not saying that's President Trump's motive.
Right.
I think his motive's totally, we haven't even talked about that yet.
But it could be somebody in the future.
I think he has a totally different motive, but that's exactly right. You can't allow this to happen, because somebody who does have that kind of motive could now use this
5,
to
10
gain
years
that kind
out.
of power.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I don't think that's President Trump's motive at all. But you said it exactly. It's not about him. It's about opening up this door, this Pandora's box that would allow somebody who does have that kind of motive to get away with it.
If you're listening and you want and you feel strongly about a wall, then you should be writing to your members of Congress in the House and the Senate and telling them that that's what you want, because they're the ones who should make that decision. That's what Lance is getting at today, is the wrong person is trying to build it. It's not the president's job to build it if there's no money to build it. If Congress says, here's the money, then it is his job to build it, but not until they do. And they've said, no, we're giving you a little money to do it. We're not giving you the $5 billion or so that you wanted. We're giving you the $1.5 billion for the area that we think it needs. And that's Democrats too.
And the really important part here is it's bipartisan.
Yeah.
I mean, I still wouldn't believe it, but it's a better argument if the other party controlled both houses of Congress and then you still said it was an emergency. That's more believable than this.
You have Democrats and Republicans.
This is a bipartisan approval.
Yes. Okay.
Which is all we said we wanted, right?
Right.
We wanted bipartisanship.
Yeah. And
we finally have it. And the president says, we're not going to listen to it.
Yeah.
I'm going to be dictatorial and do whatever I feel like.
Well, and that's where because he is going to sign it. And then he's going to do something that's in contradiction to the signature of it. That's the big thing that everybody has to just keep in mind. Again, not this president, not whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, not the wall. All of those things could still get done. We're upset because they're not being done the way the Constitution says they ought to be. And it is the president's prerogative to test it. The executive branch is welcome to try it. It's the legislative and the judiciary who then need to step up and say, no, we're not going to let you do that. We're going to check your power, Mr. President, and we're going to better define this very vague, Emergency Powers Act that we put in place.
Like when FDR during the Great Depression tried to pack the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And even though the Supreme Court liked FDR and a lot of his programs, they declared some of his programs unconstitutional.
Right.
The National Industrial Recovery Act is one of them. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was a second one. And they also said, no, you can't pack the court so that you can not have your laws declared unconstitutional. It's not his laws, but the Democratic Congress passing the laws and basically rubber stamping whatever FDR wanted. So there again, you have your system of checks and balances working where a president wanted something and during a real time of crisis, the Great Depression, and the Supreme Court, one of the branches of government said, no, this is as bad a shape as the country is in. You don't have the power to do this as the president.
And so those are the last two things because we got to get out of here. You've got, I'm not certain that if this goes to the Supreme Court, I don't know if I would find it hard to believe that they'd side with the president because, everybody says, well, you've got a 5-4 stacked conservative court. Exactly. This would be a big contradiction to what those 5 stand for typically, because they're all about constitutionality, as they should be, as all Supreme Court justices should be. I don't think that they want this. I think that's and that goes to the last point then, Lance, which you brought up, Trump's angle. I'd imagine people in his administration have explained, you understand if this goes to the Supreme Court, it's really unlikely that they're going to support you. So that goes to what Lance is leaving us with, which is what's Trump's angle in this? Well, if he knows that it's not going to work.
My whole point is that Trump is setting up a campaign issue to run for re-election in 2020.
Because it worked the first time.
Because if he really, really, really wanted to build a wall, he'd have gotten it done already. Because he had more money on the table 2 times earlier. 2 different times he's had more money on the table.
A lot more.
He had a Republican-controlled Congress that he could have asked for this to be done and gotten it built. So I'm not really sure that the president cares one way or another whether or not a wall is built. But this is a chance for him, coming out of looking bad during the government shutdown, to create a campaign issue for the 2020 election to solidify his base and to split the Democrats and give him a better chance to win re-election. I think that's Trump's true motive. Whether he gets to do this or not, whether the end result is he gets to build his wall, it's a campaign ploy by the president to solidify his base for a run-up for a re-election opportunity in the 2020 election. So there you have it. So that's my prediction.
Let us know if you like Lance's prediction or if you think there's something else going on. That's the question at the end of all of this, right, is where do you think the line ends on presidential power, and what is the current president's motive in doing this, especially if he might not be the way that some of us characterize him as narrow-minded as we think. He might be looking at he knows this isn't going to work in the long run, but it's an excellent thing to campaign on. And then you do have I did everything that was within my authority to try to do. What more can you ask, right? What more can you ask?
That's exactly right.
I mean, to me, right, that's a great way to campaign. That's for sure. A good way to get reelected is I did what I said I'd do.
I really, really tried for you.
That's right. And they said no. And
now you got to vote in more Republicans so I can get it done for you. So now I'll see how big my coattails are.
Yep. That's the thinking. So let us know your thoughts at TrueChat.org, Facebook, Twitter, at TrueChat.org on social media. And Lance, if we have new listeners, and hopefully we do because we challenged everybody, right, to bring us at least one new listener this year, what are all the ways that people can tune in?
Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere fine podcasts are found.
You got it. So please tune in and let others know as well. For the State of Us on TrueChat in Urbana, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change.